When Russia invaded Ukraine, one of the collective West's immediate responses was to impose sanctions on Russia. It's taken several years, but those sanctions look like they're finally doing what they were always intended to do. Those sanctions, combined with Russia's insane spending on the Ukraine war and the simple fact that Ukraine has defended so ably for almost 4 years, have placed the Russian economy on the brink of destruction. And Ukraine may not have to wait much longer for Russia to go from being on the brink to falling into an economic chasm from which there is no escape. Russia has a ticking time bomb that threatens its very existence, and it only has as little as 18 months max to defuse that bomb before its economy hits the breaking point. That's according to economist and CEO of Ukraine Industry Expertise, Volodymyr Vlasiuk. On October 16, Vlasiuk told Euromaidan Press, in no uncertain terms, that Russia's economic collapse is imminent unless the Kremlin does something drastic to change its course. Now, the situation is critical, Vlasiuk, who has traced Russia's economy since the beginning of the invasion, claimed. They cannot finance the war of the present intensity for a long time. And there are a trio of issues that are causing major problems for Moscow right now. First, there's Russia's budget deficit, which has quadrupled. That deficit is ballooning out of control, and not even Russia seems to be able to keep track of it. In August, the Moscow Times highlighted this fact in a report where it noted that Russia has already blown past its budget deficit estimate for 2025 just 7 months into the year. The deficit was $61.1 billion by the end of July, the outlet reports, which is already a long way ahead of the $46.99 billion Russia had planned for the deficit to be by the end of 2025. Weaker oil and gas revenues were blamed for this higher deficit, and those will be covered in a moment. However, the Moscow Times adds that several analysts believe that Russia's runaway spending on the Ukraine war is what's really to blame. One of those analysts, named MMI, said that Russia would have to slash its annual expenditure by 20% to come close to recovering some of the deficit. That wasn't going to happen, as Vladimir Putin continues to pour good money after bad into a war that Russia shows no sign of winning anytime soon. By September, Free Policy Briefs was reporting that the spiraling deficit has become the central challenge for Russia's economy in 2025. Records have been broken by the figures the Moscow Times reported, which are 129% higher than Russia's full-year target, Free Policy Briefs adds. Such a major gap threatens to drain Russia's reserves, which is another issue that will be addressed in a moment, and could potentially push Russia into issuing more debt that will only make the deficit worse over time. Bear in mind that Russia would have to pay interest on any debt that it incurs to shorten its budget deficit, as Brookings highlights. That means Russia would be trading one economic problem for another if it isn't able to increase its national revenue to the point where it can lessen the deficit. And that leads to the second in the trio of issues. Russia can't generate enough revenue to deal with its deficit. Compounding Russia's deficit issue is that it simply isn't making enough money from its oil and gas sales to rectify the problem. This is evident in the impact that Russia's oil revenues are having on the country's federal budget. As the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies notes, Russia's oil and gas sales make up anywhere between 30 and 50% of the federal budget in any given year. Those sales also contribute a staggering 20% on average to Russia's gross domestic product, or GDP, annually. But now, as Euromaidan Press points out, Russia's oil sales amount to barely 20% of the country's federal budget, which shows one very important thing. Russia isn't making enough money from its oil to support Putin's Ukraine war spending. At least, it isn't anymore. For the first few years of the war, Putin was able to get around many of the sanctions placed on Russian oil by using his country's ever-growing shadow fleet of ships. That strategy could only work for so long as price caps were implemented and Russia's main customers, namely China and India, used their positions to gain leverage, which meant Russia had to sell what oil it could for far less than it wanted. Now, the combination of Western sanctions and Ukraine's constant drone and missile strikes against Russia's energy infrastructure are starting to pay off. On October 14, Reuters reported that Russia's oil and fuel export revenue declined to $13.35 billion in September. It's less than the $13.58 billion Russia generated from these products in August, and that's even with Russia selling 5.1 million barrels of crude per day, which is the most it sold during a single month since May 2023. These higher crude sales can be explained by Russia only selling 2.4 million barrels of refined oil products per day thanks to Ukraine's refinery strikes. So, Russia is being forced to sell more of a cheaper product and less of a more expensive product, which is cutting into the country's oil revenues. Chatham House said in September the West could really make Russia feel the pain by tightening price caps to the point where Russia would essentially be selling its oil at a loss. While Russia's shadow fleet customers aren't bound by these types of price caps, they can use them as leverage to get lower prices themselves, which still hurts Russia's economy. The outlet's suggestion has come true since the publication of its article. The UK and EU price caps on Russian crude have since dropped from $60 per barrel to $47.60 per barrel. That's more pressure on Putin, and it's pressure that's forcing Russia's leader to do the third of the trio of issues that are plaguing Russia's economy, draining Russia's national wealth fund. That fund is essentially Russia's rainy day money. It's a fund into which Russia can dip into when it needs to cover shortfalls or other budgetary issues related to social programs and the like. Putin, in his single-minded determination to destroy Ukraine, has been pulling billions of dollars out of the National Wealth Fund. This is money intended for the people of Russia. How much Putin has spent depends on the source. Euromaidan Press says that this emergency fund has shrunk from $145 billion before the war started to just $40 billion now. The Moscow Times puts the number slightly lower, claiming in a June article that the fund was down to $36.4 billion by the start of that month. This amounted to the lowest level the fund has been at since 2019. Much of the money, around $6.9 billion of it in May alone, is being spent on state-backed projects, many of which are related to Russia's banking system. Russia has also been withdrawing money to help itself with the budget deficit problem mentioned earlier. This draining of the National Wealth Fund presents a major problem when combined with Russia's declining oil and gas revenues. Those revenues helped to keep the wealth fund topped up before the Ukraine war. Now, the Moscow Times says some analysts believe that the entire fund might be depleted by 2026. In September, the Russian publication, The Insider, agreed the complete draining of these funds would happen within a year, and also pointed out that overall Russian revenue has only risen by 2.8% at a time when the country's expenditures have grown by 21%. This is an imbalance of major proportions. Russia can't keep this up for long if it wants its national wealth fund to survive. Other commentators, including Brian Islin, are more hyperbolic. Russia's national wealth fund, once the Kremlin's pride, now resembles a blown safe after a burglar's visit. Technically, little left to steal, Islin says. The draining of that fund, more than anything else, highlights the cracks in Russia's economic armor because they highlight how Putin is resorting to stealing from the Russian people to finance a war that's lasted years longer than the Kremlin ever expected. Now, any one of these three issues highlighted would be worrying for Russia. All three converging into an economic tornado that threatens to tear up everything in its path is a catastrophe for Putin, and the signs of what will happen to Russia are already in full display everywhere in the country. For one thing, none of the numbers add up for Russia anymore. Mentioned earlier was that Russia's expenditure is growing far faster than the country's revenue. Vlasiuk explains to Euromaidan Press just what this means for Russia going forward. Every economy has its own specific, but we should always look for balance between expenses and revenue, Vlasiuk says. When this balance is distorted, consequences will follow. On the Ukraine military side of things, the Economist points out, Russia's expenses have grown by up to 6 times what they were before Putin launched his invasion. Russia plans to spend $183 billion on the Ukraine war in 2026 alone, which will cover 38% of Russia's total federal expenditure for the year. And that's just the figure the Kremlin is providing. Vlasiuk says that the real number may end up as high as $229 billion, which, as with Russia's budget deficit, would be a case of the Kremlin vastly underestimating the cost of maintaining Putin's war. Russia's economic woes are also highlighted in its high inflation rates, which are putting the squeeze on the average Russian, who Putin had hoped wouldn't have been affected by a so-called special military operation. Why would there have been? That operation was meant to be over in less than a week. It wasn't supposed to devolve into a war that's drawing ever closer to the end of its 4th year. At no point during September 2024 and September 2025 has Russia's monthly inflation rate dropped below 8%, according to Trading Economics. It was 8.6% in September 2024, rose to a high point of 10.3% last March, and has managed to come down to 8% as of September 2025. While Russia might take some solace in the fact that its inflation rate has dropped since its 2025 peak, 8% is still far too high. Russia's target inflation is half that amount, and it doesn't look like monthly inflation is going to approach 4% anytime soon. It certainly won't if suspicions that the Kremlin is vastly underreporting its inflation issues turn out to be true. Euromaidan Press says that alternative calculations have shown that Russia's inflation may be as high as 25.6%, driven by a mix of Western sanctions, war spending, and an expanded money supply. Russia has a history of distorting its economic data per Putin's requirements. This is also seen in Russia's interest rates. Russia's central bank chair, Elvira Nabiullina, has lowered Russia's national interest rate to 17% in what some analysts believe was a response to pressure from the country's industrial lobbies. Even a first-year economics student knows that lowering interest rates when inflation is sky high is a recipe for disaster. And that only lends more credence to the idea of an alternative to Russia's official inflation rate that's being hidden from the public. Vlasiuk certainly believes Russia's real inflation rate is far higher than it publicly declares. Euromaidan Press says that the Economists has calculated Russia's real inflation rate using a composite index that tracks both consumer and industrial prices. He came up with a figure of 25.6%, which he expects Russia to hit at some point in 2025. This rampant inflation, which likely wouldn't have been a problem were it not for Putin's invasion, has also affected the average Russian's living standards. Using prices fixed in 2021, the average monthly income in Russia was $491 in that year. In 2024, that income had dropped to $383 in constant prices, Euromaidan Press reports. Ultimately, this means that Russians in 2024 and 2025 have far less free money to spend than they did before the war. In 2021, 31% of the average Russian wages could be spent on non-essential items. Now, it's just 14%, and the number is going to keep dropping if Russia does nothing to sort out its cavalcade of economic problems. So, what happens to an economy when a country's people have less money to spend? Businesses start to experience a lot of trouble, and that's precisely what's happening to Russia's private sector right now. Sticking with this theme of imbalance in the Russian economy, Vlasiuk notes that there is an 80-20 split in the war economy Putin has created. Those who work in the military side of that economy form the 20%. Think contracted soldiers, defense manufacturers, and the like. For that 20%, wages have risen substantially to the point where they're enjoying some gains despite all of Russia's economic issues. But it's the other 80% who have the problem. They're part of Russian civilian economy, and their purchasing power has practically disappeared. As the massive inflation already discussed continues to affect essential goods such as food, that 80% who work in Russia's civil sectors are going to be hit hard. So hard that social tension will become a major challenge for Putin. It's not the time of Stalin's Soviet Union, Vlasiuk tells Euromaidan Press. Russian people have cars and other property, have some standard of living. To refuse this completely is difficult, even with ideological impulse. Now, compounding this problem is the fact that there is little that Russia's non-war related industries can do about the problems their employees face, as Putin has dedicated so much time and money into turning Russia into a wartime economy. Private sector businesses have started to truly struggle. Companies are going out of business, and it's happening in massive numbers. In early 2025, Euromaidan Press says, business deaths exceeded new business registrations by 1.5 times, which is the first time that deaths have been higher than registrations since sanctions began. As of September 2025, the outlet adds, there are 3.17 million registered enterprises in Russia. That may seem like a lot, but it's the lowest figure that Russia has recorded since 2010. Other outlets have noticed these kinds of trends in Russia's private sector. On September 25, the Moscow Times reported that the Center for Macroeconomic Analysis and Short-Term Forecasting, which is a think tank linked to the Kremlin, says that Russia's private companies are struggling. Companies that account for 23.7% of Russia's revenue are already in a financially vulnerable position, and that number is anticipated to rise to 32.5% in 2026. In other words, a huge number of Russia's private companies are at risk of bankruptcy, and their loss would only feed into the trio of financial challenges discussed during the first half of this video. Businesses are now spending 36% of their profits to service their debt, the same outlet reports. In late 2023, the percentage was 15%, and, as the insider noted on October 1st, some of Russia's private companies are so desperate to cut costs that they've shifted to 4-day work weeks. It doesn't appear that those 4-day weeks are leading to Russian citizens being paid for 5 days of work that they do over 4. Instead, this is a form of hidden unemployment, the outlet says, and it's becoming widespread throughout Russia because the country's private sector is on its knees. Now, all of this happened due to Russia's shift into a wartime economy, and the Carnegie Endowment believes that this shift will be extremely painful for Russia to reverse once the Ukraine war ends. Demobilization and the end of the war will require large-scale restructuring of demand, the release of resources from the defense sector, the redistribution of a labor force depleted by losses and emigration, and the search for new sources of hard currency, its Carnegie Politica publication says. Russia would basically be trading one economic crisis for another if it tries to shift away from the wartime economy Putin has created. That would amount to the 5th such crisis in Putin's 25 years of rule. An economic crisis every 5 years isn't a great record for any leader. All of these economic factors mean that Russia is on a very defined timeline in terms of how long it can sustain the Ukraine war at the level currently seen. That's according to Euromaidan Press, which suggests when it thinks Russia will run out of money. The time frame, 12 to 18 months from now, which is as early as October 2026. That's when Russia will be dealing with an annual deficit of $72 billion and will only have $69 billion in reserves. Several short-term solutions to this problem exist, including printing more money and pulling the last of the liquid assets of the Russian National Wealth Fund. But it won't be long before Russia will face the difficult choice between reducing its military spending, which benefits Ukraine, or seeking assistance from abroad. And there's only one country with the financial muscle Russia needs that could help in this situation. That country is China, and it already has said no, at least according to Vlasiuk. The Economist claims that Russia's Ministry of Finance has already approached Beijing with its cap in hand, begging for support. China refused, though there is a possibility that it may change its mind in the future. If it does, it will likely be because Russia is so weakened that offering support would make the country even more dependent on China than it already is. That's bad news for Putin and his people, as it means Ukraine doesn't even need to win the war for Russia to ultimately lose from the global geopolitical perspective. Taking Ukraine was supposed to strengthen Russia's international standing. Now, Russia faces the prospect of becoming little more than a vassal state of China because Putin has chased his Ukraine dream straight into an economic chasm. Ukraine and the West can combine to ensure an economic collapse as soon as October 2026 comes to fruition. Sanctions need to be both maintained and built upon. Any relief in that area means less pressure placed on Russia. The West must also support Ukraine with more weapons and ammunition to ensure the country can keep fighting while Russia's economy slowly crumbles. There can be no waiting for it to happen, Euromaidan Press says. Russia is already caught in an economic trap. The tightening of that trap will force Russia to its breaking point. Now, China's been mentioned as taking advantage of Russia's precarious situation several times, but even Russia won't admit just how far Beijing's tendrils are sneaking into Russia. The Russian Far East is falling into China and North Korea's hands, and there's nothing that Putin can do to stop it. Find out why in our video, and remember to subscribe to The Military Show for more coverage of Russia's economic pain.